Susan Swarner with the Westchester Township History Museum, and today we're going to learn some history about maple syrup and maple sugar. So let's get started. So what is maple syrup and maple sugar? Both are made from the sap of the sugar maple tree. The sap is the fluid inside the tree that flows up and down throughout the plant, sending food and nutrients to the different parts of it. You harvest that sap, you pull it out of the tree, and then you boil it. When you've boiled out most of the water, you're left with that thick, sweet syrup we eat on things like pancakes and waffles. If you continue and boil out all the water, evaporate all of it out of the maple sap, you're left with the maple sugar crystals. And those are a similar consistency to the sugar you might have in your house. The indigenous people of this area were making maple syrup and maple sugar long before any Europeans came over, long before any settlers moved into this area. So what they would do is when the weather was right and the sap started to flow, they would establish sugar camps. So large groups of people, often family members, that would all go to where the sugar maples were, harvest the sap and boil it down, and they mostly made maple sugar. Maple sugar was easier to store, it was easier to transport, so that was really the product they made most out of their maple sap. When European settlers moved into the area, they learned the maple sugar harvesting and making techniques from the Native Americans. So they learned how to harvest the sap, they learned how to boil it down into syrup and sugar, but they used some of their own materials in the process eventually. So they did introduce metal spiles, so to actually get the sap out of the tree, they would use a metal spile rather than a cut in the tree. They also used metal kettles to boil the syrup down. We're here at Shelburg Farm. The Chellberg family moved here from Sweden in 1863, and they established this farm in 1869. Eventually, their grandson Carl started to make maple syrup using the sugar maples that grow in this area. Behind me is the Sugar Shack, built by Alden Studebaker and Carl Chellberg in 1935. The Shelburg family started to sell syrup to supplement their income on the farm during the Great Depression. They would bottle it here and then ship it on the South Shore rail line to Chicago. When they first started bottling syrup in 1935, they were selling it for $2 a gallon. But by 1948, the last year they made syrup, they were selling it for $10 a gallon. They also made the process a little more high-tech than the kettles we saw earlier. And we're gonna go inside and see that now.
This big pan with these flutes in here, this is where your evaporation takes place for the most part. This is called your evaporator pans. So through osmosis, the sap is flowing through here, coming down to this area. It goes through the baffles, flows back up here, through that baffle and flows out. And then over here, you see it relieves the pan and comes back in to the two finishing pans where the process takes place. So this is approximately the first 4 to 6 hours. This is approximately the last 2 hours of finishing off. We go from 2% sugar with sap to 66% sugar with syrup over here.
Is this where you fill the...
That's where we'll take it out. And you see that it's fluted like a Ruffles potato chip. And those flutes in there, as they rise, it provides more heating surface. Because then you got the heat coming up inside the pan, more or less.
Yeah.
So it provides more heating surface for your evaporation to take place, giving you a cleaner and more efficient product.
So when you start heating the syrup, it comes in at about 2 or 3% sugar at one end of the evaporating pans. And then once it gets into the finishing pans, and you want it, when it comes out of the other end of the finishing pans, you want it at about 66% sugar, about 219 degrees. This is what happens when you let one of the finishing pans go a little dry. So there's a little bit of scorching that went on here, but you can still boil this down and get some 66% maple syrup, but it'll be good to cook with.
Oh, awesome.
You'll have a little bit of a different flavor to it.
The first step in making maple syrup and maple sugar is knowing where your sugar maple trees are. You don't have to use sugar maple trees to make syrup. Some people use red maple, some people use black, but the sugar maple has the highest content of sugar in its sap, in that fluid that runs up and down the tree. It has about 2% sugar, so it's a little sweeter than the other trees. Once you've found your sugar maples, here at Chellberg it's a little easier. We have something called a sugar bush, so it's like a grove, a whole group of sugar maples that all grow in the same spot. You're then gonna make sure it's old enough to tap. You want the sugar maple to be about 10 to 12 inches in diameter, so 10 to 12 inches across, so you know it's old enough, and then you can take the sap out of it. Next, you need the perfect weather. You really need your nights to be below freezing and then the days to be above freezing in temperature. So then at night, the sap will flow up through the tree, and then as it warms during the day, the sap will rush back down, and that's gonna get you that really good sap flow so you can harvest a lot to make syrup. Usually the maple syrup season is from late February to early April. Sometime within that window, you're gonna get the best sap flow to make your syrup with. After that, after you have the right tree, it's old enough, and you have the right weather, then you can tap your tree. That's when you're gonna use something called a spile. So you're gonna drill a hole in the tree, and then put your spile in, and this is what's gonna direct the sap from the tree into your bucket. And there's usually a little thing on the spile to let you know how deep it has to go. Then, once you have all that, and your bucket fills up with syrup, or with sap, then you can take that and boil it down into maple syrup and maple sugar. Today, maple sap collection has gotten even more high-tech. So instead of having a spile in a bucket, now you can tap the maple trees, and a lot of commercial operations do that, a lot of operations that sell the syrup. They'll put the taps in the trees and then attach the plastic tubing, and then the sap will flow through the series of plastic tubing down to one common area, often called a sugar shack, and that's where all the sap is collected and then taken to boil to make into maple syrup. So as you can see, you can tap a whole bunch of trees, but instead of having a whole bunch of buckets, you can have the sap easily moved to one area to then collect it there. Now we know that no matter what time period it is, the steps to making maple syrup and maple sugar are the same. You have to harvest it, boil it, store it, and then enjoy it. So if you want to learn more about maple sugar history in this area, you can come out here to Shelburg Farm and see the sugar maples for yourself. Again, I'm Swarner with the Westchester Township History Museum. Thank you so much for joining me today.